have me come in and talk to you all. Might seem a little after the fact. After all, Remembrance Day was a couple of weeks ago now, but I think you'll find we'll cover some different territory. You know, I didn't have a problem. I've written a lot of stuff about and studied a lot of stuff about local military things. My biggest problem is kind of narrowing it down to what I can talk about and trying to decide what not to talk about. I settled on a bit of a theme, which is, I'm going to cover 7 wars, which seems like a lot. It's really it's probably not half of the wars that Cranbrook has been connected to one way or another. I thought if someone was walking around Cranbrook, or if they knew where to go, where they might find anything reminiscent of one of the wars that so many of our people have been involved in. So we'll see what we can do here. I'm on a bit of a time thing here, so I'm not after my Maple Leafs score here. I'm watching the clock. I want to refer to my notes pretty regularly so I don't get sidetracked like I already am right now. I'm going to start with a fellow named Timoleon Love, which is just a great name. And even if I wasn't doing a war thing, I'd probably start with him. Just saying the name Timoleon Love is just fun. You know, Timoleon was born in Kansas in 1828. And in 1848, he joined one of the Kansas regiments to go to war with Mexico, of all places, in the Mexican War. This was the U.S. and Mexico. If you're wondering why Kansas was involved, if you crossed, I think, the southern border of Kansas, then you were in Mexico. And they were having some pretty serious discussions about where Texas started and ended. And the U.S. had one opinion, the Mexicans had another, and the battle began in 1848. It lasted for a couple of years, the Mexican War. He came north, I would think, we're thinking about 1858, which was the era of the Fraser Gold Rush. From there, the 1865, they came over to Wild Horse here and carried on up to the Klondike. And we have a lot of Americans in this part of the world right from about 1858 onwards, mostly searching for gold, a lot of miners. I'd love to show you a picture of them. There are plenty. I'd love to show you anything to do with them. He's in our cemetery, which is why he's, I think, probably the earliest, oldest person in our old general cemetery. He died here in 1905 at age 77, which is a pretty incredible age for the time. You know, most of Cranbrook in the early 1900s was probably 25, 30 years old. 77 would have been just incredibly ancient. And considering his life, he fought in a couple of wars down there, and his grave, I'm afraid, is unmarked. So I don't mean to trivialize Timoleon, or Tim, as apparently it's called. He was a well-known guy here. He was well-liked. I just thought I'd touch bases here with somebody who's actually born in 1848 that resides in our cemetery there. And if you're wondering about the validity of the Mexican War, out of that came, I think, California, New Mexico, Utah, parts of Nevada, Wyoming, Colorado. That's what happened after that war. You know, I'm going to go now. If we could have the next step. Oh, thank you. So here's where we are now. If anybody can guess where that is, you're doing something. And if you could guess why we're there and what war we're attached to, you're doing something too. But that is a path not too far from here. Real nice little forest path. I'm going to talk just shortly about, or for a short moment here, about John William Ridgeway. And like a number of miners, he came up here after the American Civil War. So in 1865, there was gold discovered basically here at Wild Horse Creek. And certainly all 10, 15 years before that, really all across southern BC. And there were a lot of soldiers came here. You know, he's enlisted, he's well documented. He fought for the Union, the Grand Army of the Republic. And he was in some serious battles. He was in the war for 5 years. He was in the Battle of Shiloh, he was in the Battle of Chickamauga. Really heavy-duty stuff, and a lot of those guys were. And you know, I think when the war was over, they just wanted to get away from the whole thing, from people and everything, because there's a heck of a lot of Civil War miners that showed up in this area. I chose him because a number of reasons. He lived here from 1865 on until his death. He joined Michael Phillips, who is one of our local pioneers. And Michael Phillips did a lot of exploring here. And in fact, John Ridgeway and Michael Phillips were really the first, well, according to Phillips, and he's probably right, the first to discover the Crow's Nest Pass and actually walk from here across the Alberta border, was it at the time, of course, and come out, somewhere near Fort McLeod or Pincher Creek or wherever out there. Nobody had done that before, at least no white people had done that before. And then Ridgeway decided to get a little more serious about mining, and he took up a claim on the Moye River past Lumberton. And if you don't know where Lumberton is, it's a small ghost town just a few miles out of town here. And right near Moye Falls, in fact, right on Moye Falls pretty much. And if you've ever been to Moye Falls, you'll still see the remnants of some of Ridgeway's mining claims. He and a few other fellows mined up there for a number of years until tragically in 1894, there was a major cave-in. He and another fellow were in the cave, in the mine digging. The other guy got out. Ridgeway didn't. I think it took them 8 days to dig in to find him. If you go to the next photo, if you take that path, which isn't that hard to find, it's if you're headed up to Moye Falls, it's on this side of the river, you'll find this grave, which is John Ridgeway's grave, which has been there since 1894. And for years and years, the local miners looked after it. They tended the grave site and kept it, I mean, for a grave that's out in the middle of nowhere, it's in pretty good shape. In later years, the East County Historical Society took over, and they recarved the tombstone, which is quite simple, but that's an exact replica of that tombstone there, the original one. The Historical Society had the other one. I'm not quite sure where that ended up. Oh yeah, I'm going to move on here to probably one of the more important military personages related to Cranbrook. Well, let's start with this. This is good. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode, and well into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. I don't get to do a lot of poetry. That's a poem called The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And it isn't really the charge of the 600, it's really 673, but heck. Tennyson wasn't much for details when it came to poetry. And if you're wondering why I bring that up, well, it's simply this. I mean, that charge in military history is remembered as probably the most heroic, pointless, disastrous cavalry charge in the history of cavalry charges. It was the 8th Hussar Light Brigade, and if you don't know what a hussar is, you will if you see one once. They were the cream of the crop of British cavalry, and the cavalry was the cream of the crop of the infantry and the horse brigades. It was top-notch. It was the youngest, healthiest, best horsemen. They wore the nice plumes. They had the brilliant black uniforms with the silver striping. Their sabers, they were light cavalry, no guns, just sabers. They rode like the wind, and they were really used, if used wisely, they were a very effective force. In this case, they were asked to charge up a valley surrounded on 3 sides, and the valley is, it was Balaclava, the plains of Balaclava and the Crimean Peninsula. So we're talking about the Crimean War. I won't talk much about the Crimean War, but there we are. They were asked to charge for really no good reason, directly up a valley that was surrounded by Russian cannons on 3 sides. And they were decimated, they were completely wiped out. On one hand, probably mostly because of this poem, it's considered one of the more heroic feats of cavalry charges. if you're into any kind of military strategy, it's considered one of the stupidest military feats. But nonetheless, the reason I bring it up is that our town founder, Sam Steele, won't go there, James Baker, probably will briefly, was in the 8th Hussar Light Brigade Regiment that day of that charge. And if not for the simple fact that according to a number of reputable authors, more reputable than me, he was asked at the very last minute to leave his brigade and hop up on the hill where the British generals were doing something. He was attached, for no reason that anybody could figure out, to the general's private little squad there. And with that in mind, he probably sat there like the rest of them and watched all his mates ride into this holy hell in front of him. I point that out simply because if he hadn't have been attached to that particular general and made that charge, there's a really good chance we just wouldn't be here today. I mean, in this spot at all. Cranbrook. You know, Baker was born in 1830 to a really respectable, wealthy family in London. And I say very respectable. His brother Samuel, Sir Samuel, found, the first white person that found Lake Albert on the Nile. Right about the time they were trying to find the source of the Nile, he came up with a pretty good possibility. He and his wife did the safari to that. His brother Valentine was one of the most noted military leaders in the country at the time. Previous to that, Joseph Baker, his great uncle, sailed with George Vancouver. And we know what Vancouver did, I think, if you're from the coast at all. And in fact, Vancouver and Joseph Baker spotted a nice little mountain as they were floating around the coast there, which Vancouver named Mount Baker in his honor down in Washington State. That's the kind of family that he came from. He joined the Navy, the Royal Navy, at age 15, which wasn't uncommon if you wanted some adventure, which he did. He sailed with the Navy for years, mostly around India, and they were trying to suppress the slave trade. It was so incredibly rampant in those days. He retired from the Navy, transferred to the British infantry, I think the Royal Dragoons Guards, and then he transferred again to the 8th Hussars, missing that fateful charge. He retired from military life at age 35, and by then he'd met his wife, Sarah. They had 4 kids. He graduated from Cambridge, and he retired from there. And he was 35 years old and was like, what to do? He started writing about military history, and he wrote some very, very well-respected books. So well-respected, he was invited to discuss his views with, I guess it would be, let me check here, Edward. That would be King Edward, who would become King Edward VII. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, the consort. Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. These are the people that he mingled with. And then suddenly at age 54, he and his wife and one of their sons, Valentine, just up and moved to the wilds of British Columbia. And I can tell you, it was the wilds of British Columbia. Why he did it, I don't know. I guess he was still in the adventure. He came to Cranbrook here. They bought 400 or 500 acres from the Galbraith family. They set up shop, opened a general store, started farming. He was elected MP of the area, which was a singular honor in the sense that there was probably about 12 people that could vote at the time. In fact, in 1888, John Ridgeway approached him to have him sign a document saying that John Ridgeway was here and alive and living so he could get a military pension. He approached Baker because he was the only other white permanent resident of this whole area. Although there were a lot of people mixing around with the gold miners. You know, Baker stayed here until the 1900. You know, he decided to name the farm Cranbrook Farm, which was named after an old estate that his family had in Cranbrook, Kent, England. It wasn't like he was born in Cranbrook, it was just a nice name. I think time. Probably had some nice memories. He left here in 1900. He died in England 6 years later. You know, the only real thing you can see for James Baker these days, but it's worth seeing, is the Baker House on the Baker Estate, Baker Park we call it today, which is, it's just up behind where the skating rink is put in on 14th Avenue. That area used to be an entire park, and the tourist park was part of it. And then the city put in a number of houses. So the Baker House is there. It's one of the oldest wooden structures in the interior of BC. And that took us through the Cranbrook War. But it does bring us to a fellow that James Baker had some connections with. But I'll say this, there's 46 names listed on the Wall of Honor. Not the cenotaph, but the Wall of Honor, the Wall of Remembrance in Rotary Park. 46 names under the name Boer War. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of you know about the Boer War. I'm going to give you a brief rundown here. We're talking the Second Anglo-Boer War that these names refer to, not the First War. The Boers were Dutch farmers. They moved to South Africa in the 1700s. They immediately started taking over all the land there that they could for farming. The natives, a lot of them being Zulus, who were a tough bunch, fierce would be a better word, were not pleased with that. There was a lot of fighting. It was getting to the point where Great Britain thought this is a good time to move in and take over the whole shebang, which they did. Which meant all of a sudden the Boers were now really not happy with Great Britain, with the English. The Zulus weren't happy with the English or the Boers. It was a bit of a mess. And the fighting in the First Boer War, which I think started about 1880, got a little ugly. The Boers had a way of fighting called guerrilla warfare. It was a brand new name at the time. And what it meant was they didn't line up in armies and parade about. They snuck around and they kind of shot from wherever behind trees and wherever they could find you and then disappeared. And the English, of course, wandered around in bright red uniforms, getting shot on the head. That's what happened. To the point that when finally it looked like they could have a peace settlement, they decided that they would. So they signed a peace settlement with the Boers in 1881, and everything was fine for about 5 years until gold was discovered near Pretoria, the city of Pretoria in South Africa. A lot of gold. And England thought, you know, this would be a good time to take everything over again. The Boers immediately declared independence from England, and the war began. So this was the Second Boer War. And what happened? England decided that they would just ask people to join, and they did. They put up, the call went out around the empire, come help us take over South Africa for country. And a lot of people signed up, an awful lot of people, 46 of them, yes. It's coming. Actually, you're right. You're right. Hey, go to the next one, because this is all coming. There's Baker. Yeah, that's James Baker. Incredible guy. Listen, if you get a chance to read about the Baker family, do it. Go to the next one. This is more James Baker. Yeah. This is what we expect of James Baker. This guy's a great hunter. I mean, you know, in the Navy at 15, came to Canada, crazy guy. Wait. What happened was this. The call went out throughout the empire. We need people to sign up. We need young men. We need them now. We're going to go fight the Boers in South Africa. Enter Sam Steele. Hey, if there was something happening in Canada on the frontier that was a big deal, he was there. So we have James Baker, who I found a fascinating man. This guy's is what legends are made out of. I mean, they made Hollywood movies about this guy. He was in the Louis Riel in the Red River Rebellion. He was the second guy that joined the Northwest Mounted Police because they asked him to. The Northwest Rebellion, the Klondike Gold Rush, when Sitting Bull wanted to come to Canada to surrender after the completely white Indians, the Lakota Sioux, and others completely decimated General George Custer and his 274 men. Sitting Bull said, look, I'm only going to meet Sam Steele. If you have Sam Steele there, I'll come and surrender in Canada. That's the kind of guy he was. He'd been to Cranbrook. James Baker had asked him to come here and settle some problems between the local Tanaha and the white, and really James Baker. And Sam Steele did a pretty credible job of it. There was no real violence, no trouble. He knew the area, and he made sure that they had an enlistment center set up in Fort Steele for the Boer War campaign. As it turns out, Lord Strathcona, who knew Sam Steele. Now, Lord Strathcona was the co-owner of the CPR, which was huge. He's also the guy that, big white beard, top hat, drives the last spike in Craigellachie, which is up here, over here when they joined the railroads. Pretty dominant guy. He said, look, to Sam Steele, if you can get a regiment together, I'll finance it, I'll equip it, you have to lead it. And so Sam Steele became a lieutenant colonel of the Strathcona Horse, which maybe you've heard of. In February 1900, they opened the recruiting station in Fort Steele, all across the country, Fort Steele, and that brings us to our 46 volunteers who joined from Cranbrook. Now, you know, Cranbrook was 2 years older, so these were mostly young men, nobody really older than 40, that were in the area. Some of them were lived in Cranbrook. In fact, a number of them, Cranbrook people signed up, said, yes, we'll go. I don't know if too many of them actually showed up at the enlistment station, but they managed to raise a fair amount of money for the whole occasion. And they formed the Strathcona Horse, the Kootenai Regiment of Strathcona Horse. They traveled to, in 1900, well, here we go, I'll read this. On February 10th, 1900, the men of the Strathcona Horse, joined by the town band and a large group of citizens, met at the CPR station. Now, it's right here. And if we could go to the next photo, which is a great one. Hey, there's Sam Steele in pretty much the uniform of the Strathcona Horse. This is how they dressed. They had the Stetson hats. They were all excellent horsemen, brilliant horsemen, really. That's what he wanted, that's what he got. And what Sam Steele wanted, he generally got. They were a tough bunch. The Scottish soldiers in South Africa called the Canadians, the Strathcona, they called them terriers, because these guys were pretty tough in battle. If you go to the next one, two things. So here's a picture. We're right here. That building's not there now, we are, more or less. This building was moved here a number of years ago from further up. You know, I chose this, and hey, if anybody's paying attention, you'll go, wait a minute, if that's 1900, what are those vehicles doing? This is 1914. I chose it because I have probably 15 photos of large crowds at the CPR saying goodbye to the soldiers leaving. And I thought I'd use this one just as representative of all of them, to give you an idea of, you know, they'd get 1,000 people down at the railway station here saying goodbye to the boys. It was a big deal. In a town back then of 500-600 people, if 40 of them leave, it's a big deal, especially when they're young men like that. So here we have that. I'm going to just take a second and read you something that the Herald newspaper printed about the kids, the boys, the young guys, the soldiers, leaving at, I can't believe I called them kids, I'm getting old, guys. This is what the Herald newspaper locally here wrote about the day that the Boer soldier volunteers left. And they were headed for Fort Steele to do the training, but they wrote, there were cheers for those departing as the train slowly pulled out. The vast concourse of people gathered at the station raised their voices in one prolonged cheer for the brave boys who said goodbye to home and friends, to turn their faces eastward as soldiers of the Queen. Amid the cheers, there were many sobs, as tear chased tear down the wrinkled cheeks of veterans as well as the smoother ones of the young. It was a sad occasion, and yet the patriotism and loyalty of the people predominated. The tender feelings were sacrificed on the altar of duty. The station platform and grounds were covered with a great mass of humanity. The engine gave a long, shrill warning, the band played, the crowd yelled, and as long as the train could be seen, the boys were hanging out of the window, waving farewell. Now, I chose that and this because you know what? In another 14 years, that would happen all over again, at least 3 times, as we sent 3 contingents off in the First World War. It would happen in the Second World War, and it was always down at the train station. You know, as I was putting this together, I went, this little area here has a lot of Cranbrook history in it. It's just you can't see it. You know, 1 month later, 540, we were just a small part of the Strathcona Voice, 540 men and 600 horses landed in Cape Town, but the voyage was brutal. Not for the men, for the horses. These were all hand-picked horses. These guys slept with their horses every night. I mean, their horses were their life. It would be like your tank, if you were a tank commander. It would be like your vehicle, your airplane, if it was your horse. You know, some kind of pneumonia started to go around throughout the boat, and almost all the horses died on one month. You know, and the boys writing home, I've got a lot of letters that were printed in the paper. The boys writing home spoke just so sorrowfully of watching their horse get thrown over the side somewhere in the ocean. You know, that was the worst thing that ever happened to these guys. But they got to South Africa, they got more horses, lots of battles, a few casualties. I won't go into detail here because again we're under some time, but there's some pretty, Strathcona Horse had quite a significant role in the Boer War, and if you ever do study it in history, you'll see a lot of Cranbrook names there. Specifically, you know, the war ended, it was about a 3-year war, it ended in 1902. Some of the boys came home, not as many as you might think. Some of them were dead, they couldn't, some of them were wounded, some of them stayed in England when they stopped there on the way back. One of them that came home was a local boy named John Kennedy. He came back, he died here in 1945. He just came back and worked around town. He had a number of jobs, raised a family. That family raised a family. They've raised a family. 4 generations of Kennedys, all of whom have fought in our wars. I saw Eugene Kennedy, who I had the pleasure of teaching when he was a young guy a number of years ago. I saw him in the pages of the Townsmen as some of our veterans. The old Anglican Parish Hall, which is right across on the alley, right across from the little Anglican Church on First Street, on the little hill there just up from Safeway. They sold the Anglican Parish Hall a number of, I don't know, 10 years ago, and they renamed it the Kennedy Hall. So if you go by there, there's a direct connection there to the Boer War and all the Kennedy family. Charles Spence was our last Boer War veteran. He died in 1967. He was 87 years old. And that was our last connection with the Boer War. You know, we're coming up to, okay, sorry, just a second. Yeah. Good. There's a lot that can be said about the First World War, and I'm not going to go into it. I just couldn't decide what not to say. I'll talk a little about it at the end. I am going to reference it here because I think this is pretty topical. Kate, we might move through. I was going to talk about this real quick. Let's go to the next photo. This was the old courthouse. This is Safeway parking lot. There's our cenotaph. This is a captured German cannon that we still have in town here. From the First World War, the Canadian troops actually overran a German defense position in almost the final days of the war, and they captured 10 of these field guns, which we commonly call cannons. They called them whiz-bangs because of the sound they'd make it just before they blew you to smithereens when the shells came up. After the war, they in Canada, these captured guns were a big deal. I mean, it was considered quite something to capture them, these guns. They sent out a number of weapons to each province, depending on how many people enlisted from your area, from your town. I think BC got 35. For Cranbrook to get one, the Yukon got one. I think Quebec got 45, Ontario 56. For Cranbrook to get one was a big deal. It's been on display since then, since 1920, I believe, down here. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is the same cannon. It's been repainted. We usually had it in very prominent positions, usually close to the cenotaph. Recently, the last number of years, it's ended up in the back parking lot at the Heritage Inn because the Canadian Legion was after it, and that's where the Legion is down in the basement there. So most people don't see it. When they do see it, they're not quite sure why it's here, but it's a trophy, and we won it. I'm gonna go to this, please. If you could go to the next one, please. This might look kind of topical. You know, this is November, early November, 1918. 103 years ago. The war was just about over. It was November 11th. This was probably a week and a half before. But the cloud, and people were just so happy. This 40-year-old horrible war coming to an end. And suddenly the whole world just turned a darker gray. And I think you all know that feeling. The flu had been around for centuries. Centuries of centuries. The influenza, the way we know it, been around here forever, but suddenly out of nowhere, and they don't really know where it started. There's a lot of reasons to think, speaking of Kansas, it was a group of soldiers in Kansas where it may have just bred magically like these diseases do. The soldiers were going overseas, they took it over to France. They got sick, they put them in the hospitals, which held thousands of invalided soldiers. They all got sick, and it just spread like a wildfire. I mean, if we think the Delta variation is something, this was something else again. It became known as the Spanish flu simply because the military in most of, certainly North America, most of Europe, just hushed the whole thing up. They knew this was happening. They didn't want to tell anybody. They thought maybe it will go away. We don't want to hurt morale. It's bad for morale and all that. The only country that was really honest about it was Spain. And Spain said, look, we've got a lot of people dying here. People here read about all these people dying in Spain and said, well, they've got the Spanish flu. So it's been referred to the Spanish flu ever since. In early October, people began dying, people began dying in Quebec, and then Ontario, and the prairies. Cities banned public gatherings, churches, schools, theaters, arenas, meeting halls, pubs, they were all closed, in what proved to be a vain attempt to curb the onslaught of the Spanish flu. By the end of October, the deaths began in Cranbrook. So it moved fast. I mean, in 2 weeks, it moved across Canada. People in Cranbrook, they know it probably. A little town that's not going to come here. Boom, it was here. Walter Riddell and Finley Robson were taken quickly, like in a matter of days. And what was scary about that was these were not usual flu victims. These were little kids. These weren't senior citizens or the infirm. These were young men in the prime of their life, and they were struck down in a matter of days. This was a disease that did just that. It killed the young, healthy people. Halloween was canceled across the land. The Stanley Cup playoffs were suspended. People wore masks. They tried home remedies, including camphor, glycerin, peppermint, garlic, cinnamon, goose grease, alcohol, tobacco. None of that worked. The local drugstore here, Frank Murphy, our druggist, he offered all kinds of remedies. Try this, this will help, this will help. People did that. They went down there for a week or so and bought everything until Frank Murphy got the flu and died a couple of days later. And that ended all that. People grew sick and died within days. In fact, literally within hours. Miss Lois Gamble, Mrs. Hope, Mrs. Whiteside, 10-year-old Mildred Weatherall, they all fell in the first week of November. 14-year-old twins, John and Jacob Wise, Mary Bell Somerville. The deaths carried on relentlessly. Mrs. Philly Robinson died 1 week after her husband left 3 orphans. Her sister came here to pick up the kids, and she died before they could leave Cranbrook. Wow. This is how quick this thing moved. Mayor Clapp at the time, or Mayor Lester Clapp, he just issued a plea to the people saying, look, if you're all healthy, find someone that isn't and look after them. Families were just completely laid low. Nobody could look after anybody. Doctors saw 80 patients a day. Nurses were looking after 30 families. They had a house in town here, the leased house on the corner of 2nd Avenue, 2nd Street and 10th Avenue. It's still there. They turned it into a hospital, not a hospital, they turned it into a home for the nurses that were volunteering. And 10 of them got sick out of 12. It just, there's no record, it's a problem of exactly how many people died here. The newspaper published some obituaries, and it kept publishing through the whole thing, which is why we have a lot of this information. But there's so many people that didn't get included, people that live near town, ethnic groups that they just didn't calculate as citizens. All kinds of people just weren't listed. We can assume in the Kootenays it was hundreds of people that died. And what happened is it just started to go away. This was October, November. Well, November, First World War ended November 11th. In Cranbrook, huge celebration. They rang the bells, the whistles blew, the sirens sounded. They formed a huge parade on Baker Street, down where the courthouse was, down where it's Safeway is now. It was the veterans that led it, and I mean, anybody that could walk or crawl or had a vehicle or a horse joined that parade. They came down Baker Street. They ended up just right next door here at the CPR. They lit a huge bonfire. They burned the German Kaiser, that was the leader of Germany at the time. They burned him in effigy. They sang God Save the Queen, they gave 3 cheers, and they all went home. That was the only thing that happened in Cranbrook during the epidemic. It was a biggie, and it probably didn't help anything. But the war was such a thing they couldn't not do it. The vaccinations came out in mid-November. And a great many people took advantage of it. In truth, the worst was past. The effect of the disease worldwide was beyond comprehension. I mean, tens of millions of people did. It's bad now. You know what it's like. This was way worse at the time. The workforce was completely brought to its knees. It was bad before because all the young men were fighting. But now the women that were staying home doing things, they were dying. It was a brutal time. The end of 1918 going into 1919, I don't know. I think about where we're at today, and I think it could be a lot worse, It's still considered probably one of the worst pandemics in history. And I kind of think it will be another 100 years from now. The public gathering ban, though, was lifted on December 11th, so October, November, December, that was it, for the worst part of it. It carried on for another year or two, and what happened, it wasn't just the flu, it was the pneumonia that came with it. So I'll read reports of 1920. It said, saying so-and-so died of pneumonia, a young child died of pneumonia. It's like, whoa. It was probably the flu, but they called it pneumonia to keep people from panicking too much. The stores filled with Christmas shoppers. They had a big New Year's dance at the old auditorium where the Garden Theater is, and basically everybody just moved on into the 20s, which were pretty good times. How are we doing for time?
7:36.
Yeah. Don't need to rush. We gotta get this in an hour so I can be on YouTube. That's pretty late. I'm going to jump ahead here to, let's start here. Let's next photo, please. This is 1905, and this little building here, the part behind, but this little oddly shaped building, if you look at pictures of old Cranbrook, that building shows up a lot. And it's just right over here. And we'll talk a little more about that. And it was the original Fuda store. Rakutsa Fuda and his wife, Suniko, arrived in Vancouver in about 1885. Spent some time there. They came up to this area in 1898. And by this area, I mean Cranbrook. It's just Cranbrook, when they got here, it wasn't even Cranbrook. It was just starting. I don't think the train had even come to town yet. They started a little mill on right about where Brookview is right now. They had about 150 acres. They started a lumber mill, which was a big deal then because buildings were starting to go up like crazy. So lumber mills were all over this area, and you could be quite successful. Brookview is right across from Kinsman Park on Victoria there. That whole area between here and Pinecrest and the hill going up, and they did quite well. They were really like the town's some of our earliest pioneers. They had 3 children, Frank, John, and George, and they opened this little store in 1905. It's a grocery store. And if you go to the next shop, please. This is 1938. The little building's gone. It would have been right here. And they're doing really quite well now. It was one of the nicest grocery stores on this side of town. By this side of town, I mean anything along Van Horn Street and about past 8th Avenue. The rest of the town was 8th Avenue and Baker Hill and down on Baker Street. There was a gas station at the far end. Sun Grocery was the name here. And it was a really quite a successful business. They were known as Harry and Sue, really well-liked people. But what happened on December 7th, 1941 was that the Japanese Army, the Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. naval port at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and did a lot of damage there. And suddenly, the war had been going on, the Second World War since 1939. Canada had been in it, Great Britain, Australia, all the empire. But the U.S. had been not involved, they were isolationists. This got them in the war, they declared war on Japan, which meant effectively that we were all with Japan. About 3 months later, in the local newspaper, this notice came out, and it said, it was from the Few family. And it read, "Thank you, people of Cranbrook District, who have been our loyal customers and supporters of our enterprise for the past 45 years. Owing to war restrictions on people of our racial origin, we may be compelled to close out at any time and be removed from this area. If this is to be our contribution to the Canadian war effort, we are for it 100%. We would rather be a paying asset to Cranbrook than a burden on the government, but we are prepared to follow to the letter any orders from the authorities," which is pretty big. Yeah. Sadly, and you can argue this all you want, but it's what happened. Their fears proved correct, and about a month or 2 later, all the Japanese citizens in Canada were ordered to relocation camps. We could call them prisons, they weren't quite that. But you were told where you were going to live, and they weren't great accommodations. In this case, they went to Inverness. There were 8 camps in British Columbia, which comprised about 21,000 Japanese citizens. That was just BC. They lived there for the whole course of the war. In 1943, the Canadian Custodian of Aliens liquidated all property belonging to enemy aliens through public auction. Not just this, but the Few family also, back in about 1910, they moved their sawmill from the Brookview area, they moved it up to just a little lake outside of town here, where they employed, I think, 40 Caucasian and Japanese, and it didn't matter what you were, they'd hire you to work in the mill. And it was a very successful mill. They kept that running. That was gone, all their land was gone. They never moved back. Most of the family never moved back. There's still some Feudas living in the area, and I think John Feuda might still be living in Cranbrook. But they're all buried in our little general cemetery. They all wanted to be buried here in Cranbrook. Every time I go there, it strikes me as a little odd that they finally could be permanent residents here. I guess that's how you have to do it back in those days. The lake, we always, in Cranbrook, we always said we're going up Jack Lake Road, Jack Lake. And, you know, it wasn't until I got older that we all started realizing, listen, that could be a bit of a slam here. But it had been known as that for 60 or 70 years. Obviously, for proper political correctness, that was changed 15 years ago, maybe a little longer. It was changed to Hidden Valley Road and Pilots Lane. And I think what I was sad about is the name Fuda, I don't think was ever considered. I thought at the time, you know, Fuda Lake, that probably would have been good. If you go to the next shot, we'll see what's there now. And that's right across the street. You can just see it when you walk out tonight. So when I see that building, I still think often of the Fudas and their trials and tribulations, you know, not an easy time. On the other hand, right here, this over there, was Chinatown for a lot of Cranbrook's history, right until the 1950s. If you can go to the next photo. This is a lady named Jean Sui Zi Li. So her real name would have been Sui Zi Li. She was known as Jean. A lot of the Chinese and the Japanese took English names because a lot of us English people were like, we can't pronounce that, get us something easier. Not realizing our names could be a little odd sounding to this pretty much 9/10 of the world, but what we had. You won't find Jean Sui Zi Li on the Wall of Honor in Rotary Park, nor that of her brother, World War II RCAF Royal Canadian Air Force pilot Wilson Lee, nor that of her brother William Lee, who served in the Korean War. Jean Lee's grandfather, John Lee, came from China to Cranbrook in the early 1900s. He set up shop over here in Chinatown, which was the area roughly from 7th Avenue to 6th Avenue and Van Horn Street to 1st Street. It doesn't sound like a big area, but there were hundreds of Chinese lived there. And they had their stores and their shops. Gradually, you know, they just did well in their businesses and they'd buy places outside of Chinatown and eventually move to them and really assimilate themselves around the community. And they've done a bang-up job of it over the years. He started a store, Sam Yik. The name of the store was named Sam Yik. I can't tell you why. Maybe someone he knew. And it was a very successful store. It was right on the edge of Chinatown. He died quite young. He died when he was 49 years old, and his son, Look Lee, took over the store and his business because by then they had property in Cranbrook and Kimberley. They ran the Ritz Cafe in Kimberley. And Jean Lee, I think, was born in 1924. She was the daughter of Look Lee. She had a number of brothers and sisters to mention. She enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force at Cranbrook in 1942. Now that was the same year that the Canadian military began accepting any volunteers of Chinese heritage. And she was the first and only Chinese woman to be in the women's division of the Royal Canadian Air Force at all. That was out of 17,000. So she went through the whole war, mostly down in Ontario, in Eastern Ontario. Along the way, if you could go to the next shot, here she's talking to our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King. Because she was a unique personage. I mean, she had a certain amount of fame just by being Chinese, by being the only Chinese lady, really, in a lot of the war in Canada. She also, I think at one point, Chiang Kai-shek, who was the Japanese leader, came through with his wife. And the wife met her, and they stood and talked for quite some time. I think the wife was fascinated by the fact that Jean Lee existed at all, actually. Go to the next slide. This is the Chinese Masonic Hall in Chinatown. The lodge, Chinese Masonic Lodge. It's the only building remaining that we have in Chinatown, which is why it's up here. If you go to the next one. That's it today. So food and stuff is just to the right a little ways there. This is 7th Avenue here, and it's the initial design building. If you go by there, give a moment's thought. That's our whole Chinese Chinatown sitting right there. Arthur, who's the son of Wilson Lee, Arthur Lee, the son of Wilson Lee, he's Jean Lee's nephew. He was elected to the Canadian House of Commons as in the Liberal Party in 1974. He served 5 years. He later served as the first Chinese-Canadian Liberal Party leader in Canada. That's not quite all the first. This one's pretty cool too. Before the Canadian government repealed the Chinese-Canadian Exclusion Act, following the conclusion of World War II, neither the Chinese immigrants nor their children, or their children's children, were allowed full rights as Canadian citizens. That changed in 1947, and in February of that year, Jean Lee joined 6 other veterans, Chinese veterans, in the Commodore Ballroom in Vancouver, and they became the first ever Chinese Canadians to receive their citizenship. Yeah, that's something, isn't it? What's neat about this, I've talked to Arthur Lee. He's retired now. He lives in Vancouver, I believe. And we just chat online occasionally. I just talked to him a couple of weeks ago. And Jean Suizi Lee is still alive. She lives in Maryland, in the U.S. I believe she married a fellow from Washington, D.C., diplomat. And she's been in Maryland for a long time. And she's doing really quite well. So we're going to do this right now. We're going to have a hand for Jean Sui Lee. And when I talk to Arthur, which I hope to do soon, I'm going to say you can tell Jean Lee that she got a pretty nice round of applause here in Cranbrook for all that she's done. And we're going to try and get her name, I think, and her brother's name's on the wall of honor. We'll see what we can do about that. Okay. You know, for those left behind, I'm going to just sit through this. For those left behind during the Second World War, your task became clear. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do with it. We hear about entitlement these days. I think I'm guilty of that. The realities of equipping a massive army soon came home to roost for the people of Canada. This would be about 1941. Sugar was rationed at 3/4 pound per week per person. Meat shortages became common. Gasoline ration books became a reality. You could not drive more than 40 miles an hour on any highway for 4 years. It takes a long time to go to Vancouver. No one had the gas anyway. Tin goods began to disappear as a war effort called for every type of metal, including copper, brass, iron, lead, steel, in any form, from pots and pans to keys to toothpaste tubes, which I got thinking about was a good thing because it was made of lead, so they may have saved our lives there. Salvage drives urged donations of cloth, fur, rope, rugs, mattresses, batteries, and bottles. I mean anything. Can you go to the next shot, please? Yeah. Whoa. I don't know if that rings a bell with any of you. Prem and spam to me just spell afternoon snack. Yeah. 1942, you couldn't go out and buy meat. If you could, you were lucky. Prem hit the store shelves. We don't know what it is, don't ask. But apparently, if Jim and his buddies are coming by, you can lay that out there. I remember eating Prem, probably sitting there having a snack. And my parents were getting into the whole rationing thing. They went through the war, they went through all that. They'd start talking about all this stuff. If I can play, you're lucky to have that. This was World War II, you wouldn't even have that. And they kind of give me this list. We gave up our cloth, our fur, our rope, our rugs, our mattresses, our batteries, our bottles. We gave it all up. And I'm like, well, why is there so much junk in the basement? And they'd be like, shut up, eat your Prem. That's just the way that went down. Vehicle owners were no longer allowed to purchase tires. The sugar limit dropped to ½ pound per week, which is fine because you couldn't get coffee, you couldn't get tea. You couldn't really do anything with that sugar in it. Anyway, as spring unfolded, householders were encouraged to plant victory gardens to supplement the lack of retail produce. Sugar beets were what we used for sugar. I say we, it was them. Preserves were put up. Everybody put up preserves all the time. We're still living with that. I've still got preserves in my house from the Second World War. I'm not making that up. And I'm not going to eat them. Fear of air raids meant lighting restrictions, blackout procedures. The fire hall used to sound the siren when it was fire drill, air raid drill time. Taxes were increased on liquor, tobacco, telephone rates, pretty much any personal articles. Bakeries, meat markets, beer parlors, grocery stores, tourist industries, they just all closed. There was no way to make money. Clothing restrictions were entered into the fray. I was reading this about, wow. You couldn't have frills or flounces. You couldn't have wide belts. You could not have patch pockets on the outside. You couldn't have long zippers. Now, this was serious stuff. People and myself complain about masks. I go, well, at least I have a zipper. By the final year of the war, it started to get better. But it was 1947, I believe, in Canada, before you could have just go out and buy sugar again. In Britain, it was 1954. You couldn't buy butter or sugar or anything there. It was brutal. And then we got into kind of a neat area, and I'm just going to, for those who view the years following World War II as a time of peace and prosperity, don't worry, I won't go. Picture, if you will, a forlorn setting, standing in the very heart of sin. It is there to warn of events that never happened, and we hope never will. It is an air raid site. Anybody recognize that? Well, that's anyone in school. World War II ended in 1945, but the repercussions most certainly did not. The Russians began testing their nuclear weapons in 1949, and as Russia grew ever stronger, so did the North American fear of a nuclear bomb. We entered the Cold War era of duck and cover. You know, as the communist menace grew, the Canadian government initiated a nationwide civil defense program. The responsibility for this program was passed down to the municipal, the city level, and in February 1951, Cranbrook City Council began a search for a civil defense team. So the Cold War was upon us there. Newspapers across the country published weekly bulletins entitled Learn and Live. In an effort to educate the populace of procedures in case of disaster, authorities stated it is possible to prevent 75% of the death, the horror, and the injury if we are prepared. Now, I know my preparation when I was young entailed hiding under a school desk. But if that's going to fix 75% of the horror, actually it's kind of fun, but let's not do it. In January of 1952, a Cranbrook committee was put in place to train and coordinate matters such as medical transportation services, fire protection, auxiliary police, evacuee accommodations. But here's the problem. Unfortunately, the government appointed the head of that committee to be in Nelson. Now, if you don't know, Cranbrook and Nelson have had a relationship that's looked like this for like 120 years. And Nelson mostly always won, because they had a silver one. What can you say? We had lumber, they had silver. The Cranbrook members of this committee felt the distances and terrain were unmanageable by headquarters in the west, and so we got into this kind of Cold War here, where the east and the west started fighting with each other, and it was really what we call, it was called like uncivil defense planning, would be the best name for it. That went on for 2 years. They just started going back and forth. By 1954, Cranbrook, the East County, we got our headquarters here. It was finally reality. It was time to get down to business. You know, the principal duty at the time was to ensure rapid action. So this is 7 years after we instituted the program. As it turned out, no emergencies arose for the next 6 years. In 1961, we saw some action here, not just in Cranbrook, but all across Canada. Well, the province. With a province-wide nuclear attack dress rehearsal, coinciding nicely with the 10th anniversary of the original plan, headquarters were set up throughout the Kootenays in order to test communications under simulated warlike conditions. CBC radio issued a simulated warning of enemy aircraft over northern Canada while residents took shelter with emergency supplies for 48 hours. Now, I don't recall, I was young, but I don't recall any residents taking shelter. But as luck would have it, it didn't matter. Simulated prevailing winds saved our city from simulated nuclear fallout, and they ordered us to stand down after 5 hours. There you go. This arrived in 1962, but it was really the sister air raid siren to a bigger one that looked more like an air raid siren. It had the big, huge looking speaker on it that would rotate around, and it was killer loud. It ended up in Rotary Park. And they would both go off at the same time. They tested them every 6 months, and animals would hide under their beds, and everything would stop. It was just this incredible sound. They took the one out in Rotary Park when they put the Spirit Square in 2008. Don't know where it went. It's probably in the city graduates. This one's still there. Still there. There's a lot of air raid sirens scattered throughout Canada still. Nobody takes any, nobody wants to deal with it. The city says they don't know, it's the government. The government's, it's not ours, it's the province. The province is like, no, I think maybe it's Nelson's for all we know. There it stands. I think it's kind of neat myself. Mostly because we had a Cold War and nobody got too hurt here in this area. So when you're walking by Amy Woodland, you can look at one of the last remaining air raid sirens in this little neck of the woods. And we get to, right, I think, where we should be, which is the final days. I call it the final days. If you could go to the next photo, please. This is a photo I found from 1914. This is the first Canadian contingent marching off to war. Well, they're kind of marching the wrong way here. They're marching to have a meeting and assembly. If you can go to the next one, please. I took some time and I found out where they were when they took that photo. And I superimposed the World War I veterans over top of today's. This is the Mount Baker Hotel here in the Bank in Montreal there. That's where they were walking. It kind of spooked me out at the time, and it still does a little. When I see that, I'll cross that intersection and I can almost, I don't know. Sometimes I've done enough research on some of these people and the war and stuff that Cranbrook in general, I can be walking down the street. Sometimes I'll be in Slaterville and I just say, what year am I in? Where am I? Is this 1920? You can walk on Fifth Avenue in town here and I don't think anything's changed. My block's been the same since 1960. You know, we're not that far removed from all these people that we've talked about here. The cenotaph, which is really the heart of it, isn't it? You know, to a lot of us. There's 166 names on the cenotaph, which doesn't sound like a lot. 115 of them are from World War I. 115 young men. And again, that doesn't sound like a lot until you think Cranbrook was really no more than maybe 2,000 people. You know, that would be like losing, in 4 years, that would be like losing 1,150 of our most vital, healthy, young, vibrant males in 4 years. That's the equivalent, and it was then, of losing one young man every 2 weeks for 4 years. That's what hit Cranbrook. That's what hit the country. It was a little better in World War II because I don't know why. We just were lucky. World War I, they were still fighting the war for what they believed in, and they went off and they left ones. A lot of those kids were 16 years old when they left. You know, a lot of them just never came back. I've done research on a few. I won't go into it, of course, but Murray Howard, he was a pilot with the Royal Air Force. He was killed in a dogfight over France. He shot down 2 enemy planes. Another plane came up behind, shot him. He landed safely, and he died in his plane. Frank Wilson died, like a lot of these guys, in battle, just leading his men into battle. None of them are buried here. They're all buried, if you can find their remains. They're buried in really nice cemeteries in France, in Germany, in Belgium. Really well tended, and if I may say it, probably a lot more well tended. Not counting the Legion Cemetery here, which is very well tended, but our old General Cemetery, where they don't tend any graves really. And so we have a number of World War I vets buried there. It's the way life is, I suppose. I think of Mrs. Patton, who undraped this cemetery, or this cenotaph, took the two flags off it in 1922 when it was first opened, or first seen by the people. She lost her husband, her brother-in-law, and a son in that war. You know, I was just saying, what did she go through? A lot of these people moved away from Cranbrook, a lot of the families. I think they just couldn't handle it when their kids. You know, I think more, I don't know why it pops into my head, a young fellow named Stuart Morris, who was quite a popular fellow in town here. He was about 20. I read a newspaper, little article about him tobogganing down Fink Hill in 1917. Fink Hill is right by Rotary Park, the hill that comes down there. And it's a very steep hill. It was really steep then for any vehicles or horses. They just closed it down in the winter, and the kids would start to walk up, and they just come down that hill, going like the wind by the time they got down near the fire hall there. And there was a bridge there at the time because a river ran over it. And if you weren't careful and hit that bridge, you know, and went in the water, you could hurt yourself. And I believe he sprained his wrist quite badly. He just said Stuart Morris and some of the gang were tobogganing on Fink Hill, and Stuart was in the front of the toboggan, and they wiped out, and he hurt his wrist. You know, he joined up a few months later in April, and by August he was in England, and he died of meningitis. And you know, we think of the war as being a lot of bullets and things, but it was a lot of sickness. And a lot of these soldiers died of disease from the trenches, from battle, from just living in these kind of horrible conditions for years at a time. He was one of them, and the newspaper wrote, Stuart was a big, husky, good-natured fellow. One would have thought that his splendid physique could have withstood the ravages of any disease. It didn't. I think about him, he was sledding in January here. He was dead in August in England. You know, I never saw age 21. I think of Eugene Phillips, who was awarded a military cross for bravery on the field of battle in 1918. I think too of the Avon lady. On her last desperate trip of the night, going, please, let me deliver this. Sorry, Eugene, we'll come back. I think of Eugene Phillips. He was awarded the military cross. That's a huge honor. He led his troop in battle. He destroyed a couple of machine gun nests. With no casualties. And it was a big thing for Cranbrook. Cranbrook was in a dark hole, and everybody heard Eugene won this medal. It was like, yes, he's a great guy. He died, we heard about his death just a few days after the armistice. He was one of the last Canadians to die in battle. Certainly the last of the Cranbrook boys to die, you know. And so I think that on Remembrance Day is a great time to honor these people, all these people. There's so much sacrifice, you know, for so many of us, all of us here. These are the people that did that. I suggest maybe on a nice spring evening when the lilacs are blooming, or the summer. I think sometimes the summer when the grass just is cut, and I think, yeah, this is nice, beautiful day. Maybe Christmas, you know, when the world kind of seems like a good place. That might be a good time to think of all these young men and women who gave up all their comforts and privileges, their rights and their liberties. I mean, their rights and their liberties. They give this up. They went out there and gave up their lives for us. And so, for many of these boys here, it was just like an incredibly short walk from their houses down to the memorial. And I think that when I go there. But I also think that, in a way, we hope are still with us, all these people. To me, they just always live in the shadows of our town, and I don't think I see them sometimes. But folks, I'd like to thank you for coming out. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Can we all give Jim a quick round of applause?